We're going to move our attention now to New Zealand and really to discuss what's been going on over there. It's extraordinary. There have been increasingly violent demonstrations against vaccine passports, and actually they've been resorting to using quite draconian measures, using fire extinguishers and pitchforks. And actually, the protesters have been outside Wellington's Parliament buildings for 23 days. Police have moved in riot gear and really extraordinary scenes. Let's find out exactly what is going on in New Zealand. Let's join Rex Wilderstrom. He's a journalist based there. And a very good morning to you.
Good morning, David. Yes, well, it started, as you say, 23 days ago. There was a convoy from either end of the country that descended on Parliament. It was ostensibly, or it started out as a convoy to express concern about vaccine mandates, which are affecting a wide number of people here in professions like teaching, police, and the army. And in fact, the court has since ruled that the mandates applying to police and the army are illegal. So they had some. So they had some case. The trouble was, of course, like any protest movement, they were infiltrated by all sorts of people with their own barrows to push, neo-Nazis and other agitators. And of course, over time, those people rose to the surface, if you like, and it all began to fall apart.
So essentially, just let's go back a step, which is that New Zealand imposed quite draconian measures, didn't it? It sealed itself off to try and get COVID under control. My understanding is there are 12,000 cases in New Zealand currently. Is that about right?
That's about right. Yes, it's rising very, very quickly, almost exponentially now. It's running amok. In fact, we've got more cases per capita per day than the UK had at its worst.
Which is extraordinary given the draconian measures they've imposed. And clearly, the government there decided that vaccine passports were the right decision, i.e. you had to prove proof of vaccination. Now, as a medical doctor, the thing that I don't understand is having that vaccine doesn't stop you getting COVID, it doesn't stop you transmitting it, and therefore vaccine passports are useless.
And in fact, the government received that advice from the Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Health said, certainly don't introduce them to get into, say, restaurants, cafes. You're going to simply create two stratas of society. You're going to upset a lot of people. And as you say, there's no medical basis for it. The government, which has never seen an authoritarian measure it doesn't like, went ahead and imposed them anyway. So, of course, you've now got a lot of people who feel very much excluded from society, not just those who are affected very badly from their jobs and then their livelihoods and their homes and in some cases, but you can't even go and get a cup of coffee unless you produce your papers. And so we have a very unusual situation, particularly for an egalitarian society like New Zealand.
I find that absolutely extraordinary. You know, the sort of ramifications of having to prove, you know, your medical status to have a cup of coffee, as you say, I think is extraordinary. We never thought in a functioning democracy you would actually say papers, please. This is something out of the war.
Well, it is, and it's been, of course, compared to that, and then people say, you know, how dare you, you're minimising the horrors that went on in the war, but there is no other comparison to which you can reach back when people were asked for papers to move from one place to another, unless you go to apartheid South Africa. And then again, you're accused of, reaching back to the extremes, but this is an extreme measure. And so by New Zealand standards, we've had an extreme situation. To the best of my knowledge, we've never had rubber bullets deployed against protesters in New Zealand. They were yesterday. We've never had protesters, on the other hand, tearing up paving stones and hurling them at the police. They were doing that yesterday. Fires in Parliament grounds. It's just deteriorated into an absolute mess. And in my opinion, the problem was that it wasn't treated seriously to begin with. When the protesters arrived in their convoy, they stood there initially at Parliament grounds before they began setting up their camp, and waited for somebody to come out and say, right, well, here's the conditions under which we will meet you. Clearly there were some extremists there, so nobody's going to simply walk out on the balcony and possibly get hit with something. But if emissaries had been sent out and the protest leaders, and there were some leaders at that stage, chosen to meet with those in authority, then at least they could have come out and said, well, we've had our say. For those of you for whom that is enough, you can now go. Instead, the government's response was, the Speaker of the House, Trevor Mallard, turned the sprinklers sprinklers on these people in the middle of a storm and just caused a huge mud puddle to create, and then laughed about that and put speakers on the balcony playing the Macarena and other stupid tunes at them to try and get them to go.
Well, I heard it was Barry Manilow, actually.
Yes. Yes. It was
Is that right?
Well.
Is that really right?
Yes. Yes, he crowdsourced a playlist of the most annoying tunes and then played them on the Parliament.
I'm not sure Barry Manilow would be very impressed by that.
Well, a lot of, in fact, I'll give points to James Blunt because he did tweet the Speaker and say, look, if that isn't working, I am always available.
So just on a serious note, what is the vaccine uptake rate in New Zealand?
Well, that's the other thing. It's ridiculous to be imposing these mandates. We're well above 90% in most parts of the country. There are some regions that are lagging behind, but most of us, I just got my third yesterday. Most of us are doing what's right. And even that's the other thing, those of us that are speaking out against mandates and the two-strata society that the Prime Minister are creating are not some extremists. We're not wearing tinfoil hats, as some people at the protest were actually doing. We are people who believe in vaccines and believe in health and believe in doing the right thing. But doing the right thing is having a New Zealand that encompasses everybody.
Well, I agree. And I think, freedom of choice is very, very important, particularly as someone who is a doctor with patients, as I think it's your body, it's your choice. You decide if you get vaccinated. Also, if you're now at 90-odd% in terms of vaccine uptake, then we know that you've got herd immunity. So why on earth are they pursuing this ridiculous policy?
Well, as I say, it seems to be a very authoritarian government, and particularly we have a Prime Minister who will not back down. She was asked yesterday, as fires were burning on her front doorstep, whether she had any regrets, whether she would now consider some of the concerns that the people that were there to raise, not obviously the lunatic fringe, but the people, the police and the other normal people who were there. And she was absolutely adamant that this was an attack on New Zealand values, she called it. It will not stand this sort of wartime rhetoric that you're hearing from Boris Johnson in the face of real war. Yeah. We heard from the Prime Minister talking about her own citizens yesterday.
Well, I think we've seen it here in the UK as well. I think these politicians get drunk on power. I think they, here in the UK, we had an enforced lockdown, and you can argue maybe, okay, the first one gave us time, it bought us time whilst we reassembled our troops and worked out what to do, but the subsequent lockdowns has been proven not to be of any use at all. And as I said earlier, all you do is flatten the curve. You don't change the area under the curve. And all it did was make businesses suffer, put businesses out of business, and it has caused misery for millions of people in this country. And I assume the same is true of New Zealand.
Very much so. Working as I do in radio, we're aware of advertising revenues, and we're talking to businesses all the time, and so many are struggling. I know one that opened for one day, and now they're closed for the next 2 weeks. I don't obviously know exactly what's going on there, but that's I think indicative of the struggle that some of them are going through. Others have simply closed. I know some people that were shut down under the first lockdown. They tried again, some more came along, they struggled on for a while after that. They've now gone. So that's two businesses one person's had taken out from under them in the space of less than 2 years.
And in terms of the rollout, are you vaccinating children?
We have begun to vaccinate children down to 5 at the moment. 5 to 11-year-olds are now coming into the picture. But the thing is that's the other thing. We have been behind in everything. We were behind in vaccinating. We got a letter from Pfizer saying, let's discuss vaccines. That sat on the minister's desk for 6 weeks before the offer was taken up. Then we were told we'd be at the front of the queue. We weren't. We were at the back. The quarantine situation has been an absolute mess. We haven't been allowed to buy rat tests. That's only just available to us now. I smuggled some in from the UK because I didn't want to be without them, and people obviously didn't want to be without them, but were those that brought them in before, they were seized by the government. It wasn't called seized, it was called consolidating.
Well, that's an interesting choice of word. And so where do you see this ending in terms of these protests, which are increasingly violent? And obviously you've got a democratic, accountable government which is acting in an authoritarian manner.
Well, the dangerous thing is that I know some of the people that were at the protest. I stood for Parliament some years ago, and some of them were on my campaign team, and they were basically pretty normal people, and they went there because they were against the mandates. That was it. That was as far as it went. When they weren't listened to, when they were sprinkled, when they had this music played at them and were basically mocked and smirked at, they started listening to the extremists. And I met them to begin with. They were optimistic but determined. I met them a week or so later, and they were saying, well, maybe this lunatic has a point. Maybe this conspiracy theorist is onto something, because look at the way the government is behaving. So we're radicalising perfectly reasonable people by treating them as though they were radicalised and extreme in the first place, when they were not so.
I think you're absolutely right. And my biggest concern is we're creating a two-tier society, and it doesn't matter whether you're in New Zealand or whether you're in the United Kingdom. I think it's your body. I think it's your choice. Thank you very much indeed for joining me, Rex Wilderstrom.